Something was said inside the Russian parliament that was never supposed to be said out loud. Not in that building. Not by those people. Not under a government that has spent 25 years constructing an architecture of political control so total, so suffocating, and so ruthlessly enforced that the word dissent had essentially ceased to exist as a functional concept within Russia's official institutions. What happened inside the State Duma in the last weeks was not a protest. It was not a leak. It was not an anonymous statement smuggled to a foreign journalist through 3 layers of encrypted messaging. It was said publicly, on the record, by sitting members of the Russian parliament in a chamber where saying the wrong thing has ended careers, triggered investigations, and, in some cases, produced outcomes far worse than either of those. And what they said cut directly to the heart of the single subject that Vladimir Putin has worked harder than any other to place permanently beyond the reach of public political discussion inside Russia. The war is not going the way the Russian people were told it would go. The casualties are not what the Russian government has been reporting. The soldiers are not coming home. And the men sitting inside the Duma, some of them loyalists by every measure that has ever been applied to them, have apparently calculated that the cost of silence has finally exceeded the cost of speaking. That calculation, made by those particular people in that particular institution, is what should terrify the Kremlin more than any Ukrainian strike, any Western sanction, or any battlefield reversal on the front line. Because the front line can be managed with propaganda. Battlefield losses can be obscured with state media. Economic pain can be deflected with nationalist narrative. But when the people inside the system, the people whose entire political existence depends on the system's survival, begin to say publicly what they have previously only whispered privately, something has shifted in the internal architecture of Russian political power that cannot be easily reversed. To understand why this moment is different, you have to understand what the Russian State Duma actually is, and what it is not. It is not a legislature in any meaningful Western sense. It does not draft independent legislation. It does not hold the executive branch accountable. It does not represent constituent interests in ways that could produce policy outcomes contrary to Kremlin preferences. What it is, and what it has been for the entirety of the Putin era, is a rubber stamp institution whose primary function is to provide the appearance of democratic deliberation to decisions that have already been made elsewhere. Members of the Duma, the overwhelming majority of them affiliated with United Russia or the other controlled parties that are permitted to participate in the managed democracy theater, understand their role with perfect clarity. They vote as directed. They speak within permitted parameters. They perform the choreography of parliamentary governance without exercising any of its actual substance. This is precisely why what just happened matters so much. When a rubber stamp institution begins producing statements that were not authorized by the hand holding the stamp, it does not mean the institution has suddenly discovered democratic independence. It means the people inside it have concluded that the political calculations that made compliance safe and dissent dangerous have changed in ways significant enough to justify the risk of speaking. People who have built entire careers on reading the Kremlin's temperature with precision do not suddenly misjudge it by accident. When they speak out of turn, it is because they have a reason to believe that the consequences of continued silence are now more threatening to their political survival than the consequences of limited public deviation. What specifically was said, and by whom, is the foundation of everything that follows. Several Duma deputies, including figures from within the United Russia faction itself, rather than from the token opposition parties that exist precisely to absorb manageable dissent, raised the issue of casualty figures, not in the careful, oblique language of diplomatic suggestion, directly. They stated that the official figures being reported by the Ministry of Defense bore no credible relationship to the actual losses Russian forces were sustaining on the Ukrainian front. They cited constituents. They cited families in their districts who were receiving no information about sons and husbands who had disappeared into the military system and not returned. They cited the specific, verifiable gap between the pension and compensation payments flowing out of regional budgets to military families and the casualty numbers that the Defense Ministry was simultaneously publishing. The math did not work, and they said so. But what happened next changed everything. Because the casualty question, explosive as it is, was not the only thing said. Within the same period, in the same institutional space, other voices raised the question that sits even deeper in the category of things Putin cannot afford to have publicly debated. The question of what victory actually means. The question of what the war's stated objectives were, whether those objectives have been achieved, whether they are achievable, and whether the cost of continuing to pursue them is one that Russian society can sustain. These are not questions that dissidents ask from prison cells or exiles ask from apartments in Berlin or Tbilisi. These are questions being asked by sitting members of the Russian parliament. The distinction is everything. To understand why the casualty question specifically is the one that has the power to break the political compact that sustains Putin's war, You have to understand the specific social contract that the Kremlin constructed around the mobilization it conducted in September 2022. The partial mobilization, which called up 300,000 men, and in practice swept up far more through the chaotic and often arbitrary implementation at the regional level, was sold to the Russian public on a specific set of terms. The men called up would serve limited tours. They would receive significant financial compensation. Their families would be supported. And the losses, while real, would be proportionate to the military objectives being achieved and the progress being made toward their achievement. Each one of those terms has been systematically violated. The tours have not been limited. Men mobilized in September 2022 are still serving, still on the front line, still being denied rotation and discharge on timelines that bear no relationship to what they were told when they were called up. The financial compensation, significant in absolute terms by Russian standards, has been delivered inconsistently, with regional variations so large that families in some oblasts have received a fraction of what families in others have been paid for equivalent service and equivalent loss. And the losses themselves, the number that the Duma deputies are now publicly questioning, are in a category so far removed from official acknowledgement that the gap between stated and actual casualties has become one of the most poorly concealed open secrets in Russian political life. Independent researchers, working from open source data, including regional memorial announcements, cemetery records, social media posts by families, and the same pension payment discrepancies that the Duma deputies cited, have produced casualty estimates that run to numbers the Russian government cannot officially acknowledge without triggering the kind of public reckoning that the entire propaganda architecture of the war has been constructed to prevent. The estimates from credible independent sources place Russian military deaths alone, not wounded, not missing, not captured, at figures that would represent the largest loss of Russian military life in any conflict since the Second World War. Numbers that, if officially confirmed, would reframe the entire public narrative of the war in ways that no amount of state media management could contain. The Duma deputies who raise these questions are not naive. They know the numbers. They know the gap. What they have calculated is that enough of their constituents also know the numbers, or know enough of the numbers, that the political cost of continuing to perform ignorance now exceeds the political risk of acknowledging what their constituents already believe to be true. This is not courage. This is arithmetic. But it is arithmetic with profound consequences, because it signals that the information barrier that the Kremlin erected around casualty data is no longer functioning as a political containment mechanism. The information has leaked into Russian society at the family level, at the village level, at the regional level, in ways that official denial can no longer plausibly manage. However, the most dangerous thing said in the Duma was not about casualties. It was about the end. Specifically about the absence of any credible, publicly articulable definition of what the end of this war looks like for Russia. Putin launched the invasion with stated objectives that have shifted so many times in response to so many military realities that the current official justification for the war's continuation bears almost no resemblance to what was said on February 24th, 2022. Denazification, demilitarization, the protection of Russian speakers in Donbass, the prevention of NATO expansion, the destruction of the Ukrainian state as a political project, and now some combination of buffer zones, territorial consolidation, and security guarantees that changes shape with every negotiating context. The objective has been whatever was needed to justify the previous month's losses in the previous month's military situation. What the Duma deputies are now asking, with a directness that has no precedent in the Putin era, is what the endpoint actually is. Not rhetorically, concretely. What territory? What timeline? What conditions? What does Russia look like when this is over? And how does the Russian government propose to get there from where Russia currently stands on a front line that has moved with agonizing slowness at catastrophic cost for 2 years? That question, asked publicly by sitting parliamentarians, is the question that Putin's entire political management of the war has been constructed to prevent from entering official discourse. Because the honest answer to that question, the answer that reflects the actual military and economic situation Russia is in, is not one that can be delivered without shattering the narrative of inevitable Russian victory that state media has been constructing since the first week of the invasion. The international context surrounding this moment adds a layer of pressure that the Kremlin cannot easily deflect. Western capitals have spent the past several months debating a peace framework that would require, among other things, a Russian acknowledgement of territorial limits and a cessation of offensive operations. The Kremlin's public position has been that no negotiation is possible on terms that do not recognize Russian sovereignty over the occupied territories, including Crimea. But the internal debates that the Duma statements have now brought partially into public view suggest that at least some members of Russia's political class understand that the public position and the achievable reality are diverging at a rate that is becoming politically unsustainable. The economic dimension of this divergence is critical and underreported. Russia's war economy has sustained military production at enormous cost to every other sector of the Russian economy. Interest rates have been held at levels that would strangle any normal economy, currently sitting above 16%, specifically to combat the inflation generated by pouring government spending into defense production, while consumer goods remain scarce and import-dependent. The ruble has been managed through capital controls rather than genuine economic strength. Regional budgets across Russia have been depleted by the compensation payments flowing to military families, creating fiscal crises and oblast governments that are now competing with federal defense spending for resources they no longer have. The Duma deputies, who represent those regions, are hearing about these fiscal pressures from governors and regional officials, who are running out of room to absorb the costs of a war that was supposed to be over years ago. What most people don't realize is that the regional dimension of this political pressure is potentially more dangerous to Kremlin's stability than anything happening in Moscow itself. Russia is a federation in name and a centralized state in practice, but the centralization has always depended on a bargain with regional elites. The center gets political compliance and resource extraction. The regions get a share of federal transfers, a degree of administrative autonomy in local affairs, and the protection of the federal security apparatus. That bargain is under strain in ways that have no precedent in the Putin era. Regional budgets depleted, regional populations bearing disproportionate shares of mobilization losses, because the mobilization swept up men from economically peripheral regions at rates far higher than from Moscow and St. Petersburg. Regional officials being asked to manage public grief and economic hardship while simultaneously performing the loyalty theater that the Kremlin requires. The Duma deputies are the transmission belt between regional reality and federal politics. When they speak, they are not just speaking for themselves. They are transmitting signals from a provincial Russia that the Kremlin's urban, centralized political apparatus is increasingly disconnected from. The security services' response to the Duma statements will tell the next chapter of this story. The FSB and the Kremlin's political management apparatus have a well-documented playbook for handling unwanted political speech: investigations, pressure on family members, administrative harassment. In more serious cases, criminal charges under the extensive legal architecture that Russia has constructed around the criminalization of speech that contradicts official military narratives, the law against discrediting the Russian armed forces, the law against spreading false information about military operations, the law against calling the war a war rather than a special military operation, which remains technically in force even as the word war has crept back into official usage through sheer practical necessity. All of these instruments are available. All of them have been used against private citizens, journalists, and activists with devastating effectiveness. But here is the dimension that makes applying those instruments to sitting Duma deputies categorically different from applying them to civilians. Duma deputies have institutional standing. They have political networks. They have constituents whose awareness of their targeting would itself become a political event. Arresting or formally investigating a Duma deputy for statements made in the parliament, the institution that exists precisely to perform the legitimacy of Russian democratic governance, would produce exactly the kind of visible political crisis that the Kremlin's entire management strategy is designed to avoid. It would confirm, publicly and undeniably, that the parliament is not a deliberative institution, but a controlled space where speaking honestly about the war carries criminal consequences. That confirmation would send a signal through every level of Russian political and official life that would accelerate, not contain, the private conversations now becoming public ones. The Kremlin is therefore in a position it has rarely occupied in the Putin era. It cannot easily silence what has been said. It cannot pretend what has been said was not said. It cannot fully endorse what has been said without opening political space it does not want opened. And it cannot ignore what has been said without allowing the signal that the political calculation around public dissent has shifted to propagate further through the system. Every option available involves costs that the Kremlin would, under normal circumstances, not be willing to pay. These are not normal circumstances. Putin has spent 25 years building a political system specifically designed to prevent this kind of moment. The managed democracy, the controlled opposition, the state media monopoly, the legal infrastructure criminalizing dissent, the FSB's pervasive surveillance of political space, the careful cultivation of a political class whose survival is entirely dependent on loyalty to the system, and who, therefore, have every rational incentive to maintain that loyalty regardless of their private views. All of it was constructed to ensure that the kind of public deviation from official narrative that is now occurring inside the Duma would be structurally impossible. The system was not supposed to allow this. The system is allowing it, and that means something in the system has changed in ways that the system itself was not designed to accommodate. History offers uncomfortable precedents for what happens when the institutions of authoritarian states begin producing unauthorized political speech during losing wars. It does not always end in immediate collapse. Sometimes it ends in purges that temporarily restore control at the cost of further hollowing out the institutional competence the state depends on. Sometimes it ends in factional struggles within the elite that produce outcomes neither faction intended or wanted. And sometimes, in the cases that define the history of the 20th century, it ends in the kind of cascading institutional failure that no one inside the system predicted until it was already happening too fast to stop. Russia is not at that point. The Duma statements are a signal, not a revolution. The men who made them are political survivors by instinct and training, and they will calibrate their next moves with the same careful calculation of personal risk that has defined their entire careers. They are not heroes, they are not dissidents, they are politicians, reading a changing room and adjusting accordingly. But the room is changing. That is the point. The room is changing in ways that the Kremlin's political management infrastructure was specifically constructed to prevent. And it is changing anyway, because the war has created pressures that no political management system, however sophisticated, can indefinitely contain when the underlying reality it is managing has diverged this far from the narrative being used to justify it. Putin feared many things across his long tenure. He feared NATO expansion and invaded Ukraine partly in response to that fear, producing the largest NATO expansion in decades as a direct consequence. He feared color revolutions, the popular uprisings that swept neighboring states and that his entire domestic political architecture was designed to make impossible in Russia. He feared economic sanctions and built up currency reserves and attempted import substitution programs for years in an effort to reduce their impact, with results that the semiconductor crisis has now exposed as deeply inadequate. But the thing he feared most, the thing that the entire architecture of managed democracy and state media and legal repression was most specifically constructed to prevent, was always this: the moment when the people inside the system, the people whose complicity makes the system function, begin to calculate that the system can no longer protect them as effectively as it once did. That moment, when it arrives, does not announce itself with drama or clarity. It arrives quietly, in parliamentary statements that go slightly further than they should have, in questions asked in public that were previously only asked in private, in the arithmetic of political survival shifting by degrees that are individually small and collectively enormous. The Duma just said the unthinkable, not because its members suddenly found courage, because they suddenly found that the cost of thinking it in silence had exceeded the cost of saying it out loud. That shift, quiet as it appears, is the thing Putin spent 25 years in the entire apparatus of Russian state power trying to prevent. It has arrived anyway, and the question now is not whether the signal is real. The question is what comes next in a system that was never designed to answer it.